This is the last video lesson for Unit 2, in which we will examine two examples of tragic legacies of historical globalization on Indigenous people in Africa: the Rwandan genocide and South African apartheid. Both the genocide in Rwanda and system of apartheid in South Africa were caused by legacies of imperialism and Eurocentrism that had its peak during the scramble for Africa. European colonization of Rwanda and South Africa were the results of European colonization and racism towards African indigenous people, and both Rwanda and South Africa continue to deal with these legacies today. However, people living in South Africa and Rwanda have responded to these legacies by attempting to reconcile their tragic history and build a more just society today. Let's start with Rwanda. Rwanda is a small country in Central Africa, surrounded by other African countries such as Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Tanzania, and Burundi. In 1994, Rwanda experienced a genocide, which is the deliberate killing of a large group of people based on a particular ethnicity or race. Over 800,000 people, mostly from an indigenous group called Tutsis, were killed by another indigenous group called Hutus in a genocide that occurred during a civil war in Rwanda. How could this happen? To understand the Rwandan genocide, you need to go back to the scramble for Africa and European colonization of Rwanda. Rwanda was originally colonized by Germany, but after World War I, it was colonized by Belgium. Rwanda consisted of three different indigenous groups: the Hutu, which consisted of a majority of 80% of the indigenous population of Rwanda; the Tutsi, which made up of 15% of the indigenous population; and the Twa, which only consisted of about 5% of the indigenous population. The Belgian colonizers treated each indigenous group differently during the colonization of Rwanda. The Belgians believed the Tutsis appeared physically to be more European-looking, received better treatment than the Hutus and the Twa. Tutsis tended livestock, while the Hutus farmed crops, and since the Belgians believed livestock were considered to be more valuable, Tutsis were considered a higher status than Hutus. Tutsis were given preferential treatment, received better education and work, and were considered to be a higher social status by the Belgians, while the Hutus were treated harshly, received poor education, and were often punished as the second-class citizens of Rwanda. Furthermore, the Belgian colonial government forced all indigenous people in Rwanda to carry identity cards to identify them as either Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. The Belgians were using their Eurocentric attitudes to segregate the indigenous population and created within them a divide which would result in Hutus developing a hatred for Tutsis. Tutsis were given better treatment than Hutus, while Hutus were often treated harshly and brutally. Fast forward to the 1960s, many African nations were fighting for their independence from Belgian colonial rule, and Rwanda was fighting for its liberation from Belgium. During the early 1960s, Belgium was planning on giving Rwanda its independence as a country. The only issue was how to decide who should take control of Rwanda in its post-colonial independence. Both the Hutus and Tutsis believed that they should be allowed to govern Rwanda. However, it was evident that the two indigenous groups could not cooperate with each other due to years of being divided by colonial rule. In 1962, Belgium declared Rwanda an independent country and gave Rwanda its first democratic election to choose its first post-colonial government. Naturally, the Hutus, making up 80% of the population, voted for a Hutu-led government, and many Hutus believed this was a chance for Hutus to turn the tables against the Tutsis. Belgium maintained a small security force for Rwanda, but otherwise Rwanda was free to decide its own future. Immediately, Tutsis began to organize themselves to take power away from the Hutu government, and a Tutsi-led militia called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, emerged in Rwanda. The RPF created its own rebel army that was supported by governments of Congo and Uganda, and by the mid-1960s, the RPF began fighting against the Hutu government. Rwanda entered this long civil war between the Hutus and Tutsis that lasted during the 1960s all the way to the 1990s. By the 1980s, Rwanda was struggling economically. The Hutu government was failing to provide enough jobs for Rwandans, and tension between the Hutus and Tutsis began to increase. As well, the Tutsis' RPF was becoming more extreme, and fighting between the RPF and the Hutu government started to intensify. Also during this time, the United Nations sent a peacekeeping force to Rwanda to try to keep the fighting between the Hutus and Tutsis from boiling over. By the early 1990s, hatred and tension between the Hutus and Tutsis was at a breaking point. Things got worse in 1994 when the Hutu government formed its own paramilitary organization called the Interahamwe, which was an extremist group of militant Hutus who were targeting Tutsis with violence. Then a crisis point occurred on April 6, 1994, when the Hutu president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana, was killed when his airplane was shot down. Immediately, Hutus began spreading rumors that the president had been assassinated by the Tutsi RPF. The Hutu Interahamwe took over Rwandan radio stations and were broadcasting hate-filled messages that Tutsis were responsible for the president's death. The Interahamwe called Tutsis cockroaches and said that Tutsis must be punished. Violence increased in Rwanda as Hutus began targeting Tutsis in the street and in their own homes. By late 1994, the Interahamwe began arming Hutus with machetes and ordering Hutus to begin killing Tutsis wherever they could be found. On July 19, 1994, over 800,000 Tutsis and Hutus who were protecting Tutsis have been slaughtered to death by everyday ordinary Hutus. Most Hutus were responsible for the killings were ordinary people who got caught up in the anger and rage brought on by the Hutu government and the Interahamwe. Over 1 million people fled Rwanda as refugees to neighboring countries of Burundi and Tanzania. As the genocide went on, the civil war between the Hutu government and the Tutsi RPF continued. RPF forces captured the capital city of Kigali, and the Hutu government leaders stepped down, and the Tutsis formed a new government in Rwanda. This helped end the genocide as Tutsi forces took control of Rwanda, and as a result, millions of Hutus then fled Rwanda in fear of Tutsi attacks in revenge against the genocide. Sadly, the United Nations peacekeeping forces that were in Rwanda to keep peace during the civil war failed to stop the genocide. The UN has received harsh criticism for failing to prevent or stop the genocide when it was in a position to do so. So how has the country of Rwanda responded to the 1994 genocide? Soon after the end of the genocide and defeat of the Hutu government, the Tutsi-led government began arresting the leaders of the Hutu government and the Interahamwe. Many high-ranking Hutu government leaders were convicted of crimes against humanity in the UN International Criminal Court. But what about the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Hutu people who also committed crimes? How could Rwanda possibly reconcile this tragic event? One way was that the Tutsis government held a series of local courts called Gacaca courts all across Rwanda. The word Gacaca translated means justice on the grass. Here, the local communities could identify Hutus who were responsible for killings and violence during the genocide and be forced to admit their crimes and stand accused before the community. More often, Hutus who were accused of horrible crimes were allowed to integrate back into the community as an attempt to heal the deep wounds that Rwanda had suffered. Although the international community criticized Gacaca courts as perpetuating violence, allowing criminals to get away with their crimes of murder and walk among the relatives of people they killed, this seemed to bring a sense of closure to post-genocide Rwanda. Now let's move to South Africa and apartheid. South Africa is located at the southern tip of the continent of Africa. It has a population of approximately 54 million people. The majority of that population is considered to be Black or Indigenous African, with a minority population of whites, who are descendants of white European settlers. South Africa has 11 official languages, mostly various indigenous languages, but the language most spoken is Afrikaans, which is a mixture of English, Dutch, and indigenous languages. The colonial history of South Africa starts in 1652 when a number of European empires, including the British, the Dutch, the French, and the Portuguese, began to colonize the southern area of Africa, namely the port city of Cape Town. Cape Town was an important trading and shipping port for various European nations who stopped there on their voyage to India and China for trade. Eventually, settlers from the Netherlands, who became known as Boers, began to create farming and mining settlements in the area. The Boers established farming settlements while the British controlled the Cape Province. The Boer settlers expanded their farming settlements, which created conflicts with the indigenous peoples in South Africa, namely the Xhosa, the Zulu, and the Sotho tribes. They often clashed with each other over territory, and the Boers forcibly displaced the indigenous from their lands. Then, during the late 1800s, things intensified as the British discovered valuable resources in South Africa, namely diamonds and gold. Because of this, the British sought to take control of the Boer farming settlements and began driving the indigenous even further from their lands. The British combined the three Boer settlements into one British colony called the Union of South Africa in 1910. And in 1931, the Union of South Africa became an independent sovereign state from the British Empire, and the country of South Africa was created. Not long after its independence, the South African government, which was controlled by the white British and Boer settlers, began to create the system of apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid in Afrikaans means apartness, which refers to a policy of segregation between white and indigenous people. The system of apartheid included a wide number of laws and policies that sought to create racial divisions and gave white South Africans power while taking power away from the indigenous South Africans. The South African government established four racial classifications of people: whites, who were Europeans; blacks, who were indigenous; colored, who were people of mixed race; and Asians, who were immigrants from Asian countries like India. Under the apartheid laws, only whites were allowed to vote and have citizenship status, while blacks, colored, and Asians had no citizenship status at all. Blacks and Asians were forced to live in townships, which were poor, isolated communities throughout South Africa, while whites lived in wealthy, prosperous communities. Whites were given better jobs, better schools, and better housing than blacks. Whites and blacks had separate restaurants, beaches, government agencies, you name it. As eventually, apartheid laws even banned marriages between whites and blacks, which meant it became illegal to have colored or mixed race children. Basically, apartheid gave the white European minority complete control of South Africa, while the black indigenous population had no power at all. How did the whites enforce apartheid? Through force and violence. The white South African government used brutal force to keep the black majority under control. Any resistance by the blacks against the system of apartheid was met with harsh penalties and force from the police. The police often terrorized the blacks, keeping them afraid and obedient. This brutal control intensified throughout the 1960s and the 1970s as the South African government and police forcibly displaced millions of blacks to what were known as tribal homelands, remote communities created by the governments for blacks to live. These places were basically slums and shantytowns. The living conditions were horrible, and there were high rates of crime and social problems. Any blacks who resisted were arrested and imprisoned. During apartheid, there were a number of blacks that organized themselves politically to resist the South African government. Even though it was illegal to protest against apartheid, an organization called the African National Congress, or ANC, emerged, which was led by a young politically minded leader named Nelson Mandela. Mandela and the ANC organized peaceful protests against apartheid, and by the 1960s, Mandela became a popular leader in the movement to end apartheid. However, the South African government cracked down on the ANC's peaceful political protests. One such example is when the police reacted harshly towards a peaceful protest of about 7,000 black South Africans at a township called Sharpeville. The protesters demanded the release of a number of black prisoners who were being held by the police in Sharpeville. The police attempted to disperse the peaceful protest, and when they refused, the police opened fire on unarmed black protesters. 69 young black protesters were killed and 1,800 were arrested. This event became known as the Sharpeville Massacre, and it sparked an uproar amongst black South Africans. They intensified their resistance to apartheid. In response, the South African government began arresting ANC leaders. And in 1962, the South African government banned the African National Congress and arrested its leaders, including Nelson Mandela. Mandela was charged and convicted of attempting to overthrow the government and was sentenced to life in prison. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the brutality of apartheid got worse. Violence was increasing, and unemployment and crime was at its highest, and the South African economy began to suffer. The breaking point came on June 6, 1976, during a student protest at a township called Soweto. 20,000 black protesters organized a protest against the appalling conditions of black schools due to the severe lack of funding from the South African government. Black students and schools received a fraction of the funds that white students and schools were receiving. At the Soweto protest, again, the police used brutal force to end the protest. Police beat and shot unarmed students, resulting in 350 students killed and thousands more injured. A photojournalist took this photo of a black student carrying his beaten sister fleeing from the police, and the photo was released to the international press. The photo made headlines in newspapers around the world, and reports of the Soweto protests created an international backlash towards the brutality of the South African apartheid. Many countries have condemned apartheid and put pressure on the South African government to bring apartheid to an end. By the late 1980s, the majority of white South Africans were joining the resistance against apartheid. In 1989, white President F.W. de Klerk was elected to South African government, and immediately he began the process of dismantling apartheid laws. De Klerk called for a non-racist South Africa. He lifted the ban on the African National Congress and called for a referendum on ending apartheid. The referendum showed that most white South Africans supported the ending of apartheid. In 1992, ANC leaders were freed from prison, including Nelson Mandela, and de Klerk granted all South Africans, whites, blacks, colored, and Asians, the right to vote. In 1994, South Africa had its first free election for all South Africans. Nelson Mandela, who ran for president as leader of the ANC, won in a landslide, making Mandela the first black president of South Africa. Apartheid was over, and South Africa became a free country. Where did South Africa go after Mandela became president? Apartheid may have ended, but the country was still suffering from decades of racism and economic problems. The country still had high rates of unemployment and crime, and there were still tensions between some whites and blacks. In an effort to reconcile South Africa's turbulent past under apartheid, Mandela sought to bring whites and blacks together to form what he called a rainbow nation. Mandela established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was similar to Canada's after the end of residential schools. In South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, blacks could publicly accuse former white police officers and government officials of crimes they committed during the apartheid era. Whites who were accused stood trial for their crimes. Some were convicted and sent to prison. However, most whites were not given a prison sentence. Instead, if they recognized their crimes, they could be integrated back into society. This was Mandela's attempt to heal the country and bring whites and blacks together instead of further dividing them. These efforts of Nelson Mandela earned him respect worldwide as a symbol of peace and advocate for social justice and human rights. In conclusion, the Rwandan genocide and South Africa's system of apartheid are examples of the devastating effects of the legacies of European imperialism and colonization on the indigenous people in Africa. Both the genocide in Rwanda and apartheid in South Africa were caused by Eurocentrism and racism. Europeans with a sense of superiority over indigenous African people used racist policies to control indigenous people, and the results were devastating. As well, efforts to reconcile these devastating effects in Rwanda and South Africa were similar, in the efforts to heal the countries after tragic events created by the legacies of imperialism.